Last year we had a year of Paul, and this year we saw that it was the anniversary, 800th anniversary of the first rule for the order of Christ. And I thought it was important to highlight the tradition so that our community, and those who come from outside the local community, could learn about this very rich and important tradition, and also to realize that the Catholic intellectual tradition is comprised of many important strains down through the centuries. It's not monolithic. It has many rivers and tributaries, if you will, significant ones that we thought would be important to highlight. So hopefully this year, if anyone on this campus does not know that there is, in fact, a vibrant, strong, very important Franciscan intellectual tradition, then we have some real problems. I'm delighted you're here. And today's lecture on Franciscan spirituality in Clare and Francis of Assisi will be given by Brother William Short, who's delighted for happening here. He makes the claim that my greatest passion is to help others unpack the revolutionary insights of Francis and Clare of Assisi. It is amazing to realize that these two friends had a vision of an inclusive church community 800 years ago. I am delighted to be at the Franciscan School where I have the freedom to explore their wonderful vision and to do that in a community of brothers and sisters trying to live that vision today. Is that a wonderful statement? Mm-hmm. Well, Brother Short is here from the West Coast. He did his graduate work at Contemplative University and the Franciscan School of Theology, where he teaches. He's also the director of the Retreat Center there in California, not necessarily at the Franciscan School of Theology. And he does a lot of work also with the Franciscan novices. We're delighted to have Brother Bill with us today, who is certainly a scholar and a lover of Francis and Clare. And most importantly today, give us insights into their spirituality, and hopefully each of us can take something with us today from what he has to share with us that will enrich each of our lives, especially our own personal spirituality. So let's welcome Brother William Short to Villanova in a very warm fashion.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. It's a delight to be with you in an Augustinian institution, being hosted by a Dominican in the presence of Franciscans and Sisters of St. Joseph and others whom I probably don't even know. It's my first visit to Villanova. I'm glad that I got here. I was at Newman in Aston earlier this year, and someone there said, I'll look forward to seeing you at Villanova. My laptop had expired in late June, and we had not been able to recover the calendar, so I didn't realize I was coming to Villanova until I was down at Aston, and they reminded me. So I'm doubly delighted that I was here and that I remembered to come. As you can already tell, someone who is that absent-minded might go on a bit. So I think out of a sense of mutual safety and security, if someone has a wristwatch that they would allow me to borrow. That will probably make sure that you get out of here before dinner time. I see one of the TOR friars, Kevin. This was not set up. You actually did this spontaneously. It's always easier to steal things from the friars because they have a way of getting them back. Well, except Kevin, it says it's 4:45, and is that right?
5 minutes fast.
It's a little
5
fast.
minutes fast.
4:40.
We want to be out of here by 5:30.
Quarter to whatever.
Yeah.
Just do your thing.
All right. Please feel free to leave at any time. Just genuflect on your way out and leave an offering. The topic that I would like to speak about is a very general one. And for a number of you, it may seem very elementary. Some of you I know are scholars in your own right in the field of Franciscan studies. And for others, this might be quite new, especially those of you who are being educated in an Augustinian university, may not have had a great deal of exposure to Francis and Clare of Assisi. So I'll try to strike a middle ground to give some basic information about these two great saints, but then also to go into a little bit more depth, particularly in regard to some of the unique features of their spirituality. And let me start with a statement that I believe is self-evident. Sometimes the most profound experiences begin with a very simple act. And in the case of the great saints of Assisi, Francis and Clare from the early 13th century, the very simple act was listening to a reading from the Gospel. At Mass, in a small church, in an unimportant part of town, down in an agricultural area. Let me read you the story from the earliest biography that we have of Francis of Assisi, written by his contemporary, one of his brothers, Thomas of Celano. It was written shortly after his death in 1226. Here it is. One day the gospel was being read in that church about how the Lord sent out his disciples to preach. In order to understand better the words of the gospel, he, this is Francis, humbly begged the priest after the Mass to explain the gospel to him. Now realize the gospel was read in Latin. Francis would have spoken an early form of Italian, and he would have studied Latin in school, but to have a whole gospel read in Latin, you might not catch it all. The priest explained it all to him, line by line. When he heard that Christ's disciples should not possess gold or silver or money, or carry on their journey a wallet or a sack, nor bread nor staff, not to have shoes nor 2 tunics, but that they should preach the kingdom of God and penance, Francis immediately exulted in the Spirit of God. "This is what I want," he said. "This is what I seek. This is what I desire with all my heart." Imagine the poor priest at this point. What's going on here? He did not delay before he devoutly began to put into effect what he heard. Immediately, notice that word, immediately, he took off the shoes from his feet, put down the staff from his hands, and, satisfied with 1 tunic, exchanged his leather belt for a cord. As for the other things he heard, he set about doing them with great care and reverence. I mean, it's a remarkable experience, I suppose, for this priest. There's no evidence that he knew Francis or what he was about. This young man, he would have been in his 20s, early 20s at the time, comes up to him after Mass and said, "Would you explain that gospel you just read?" So he's going through it. This is, okay, do you know what that word means? You know what that, this is discípulos, and this is Jesus. Yeah, okay. Explain, okay, next line, explains the whole thing. And at the end, this dramatic reaction. That's what I've been looking for. That's it, right there. You got it. You said it. That's it. I was waiting for that. I knew. Somehow he had understood enough of the Latin to know there was something there. And when it was finally explained to him, he said, that's it. Look no further. And really, for the rest of his life, Francis does not turn back. Now, there is a build-up to the story. There is a pretext to this text that Francis had been going through a process, and I'll speak about that in a moment. This didn't come out of the blue. He was looking for something. But when he found it, when he heard it, he recognized it. And he said, that is the thing right there. And I think this is the genius of Franciscan spirituality, whether in Francis or in Clare. It's that turning back to the gospel, the very basic text, the words and the deeds of Jesus proclaimed in the New Testament. It is what we might call basic discipleship, kind of Christianity 101A. It's nothing fancy. It's not complicated. It doesn't require a great deal of complex interpretation, although I've spent the last 20 years trying to figure it out. At its core, it's actually kind of simple. What this kind of discipleship requires, on the other hand, is the very important virtues of sincerity and generosity. The story sounds simple. And that spontaneous response of the young Francis, this is what I want. That's it. You've got it right there in that book. It had lifelong consequences that demanded of him sacrifice and included a fair amount of suffering. So the fact that the response was simple and immediate and direct doesn't mean that the story went on happily ever after. A lot of the time, the story was actually pretty dark and difficult, but he didn't turn back. That is also true, however, of the life of any genuine disciple of a master who got himself crucified. And that seems also to be fairly well predicted in the New Testament. If you want to follow this guy, you're going to get into trouble. This young Francesco, as he was called by his friends, in his early 20s had grown up in a comfortable middle-class family of cloth merchants. His dad sold pants, and he sold clothes. That's what he did. He had fought on the side of his hometown of Assisi in a war against a neighboring city, and had been a prisoner of war. That was when he was still in his late teens. He had, like many men of his time, the dream of becoming a knight. He wanted to go fight in the Crusades, which were a big event at the time. That would open the door for him for stepping up socially, to be able to marry into the upper class of Assisi's noble families. He would be Sir Francis instead of just Francis, the guy who sells pants. But he had heard a voice. And quite literally, the ordinary voice of the priest, whose name is not given to us, who was reading the gospel at Mass one day. No indication it was an extraordinary kind of day at all. But in that voice that he heard, as the priest read that gospel in Latin, he heard another word, a word within the words. And it was that word that melted his heart. That's what got that response. This is what I want. That's what I've been looking for. He heard the voice of Jesus speaking to him and giving direction to his life. And as soon as he heard those words, he reacted immediately. The early writer emphasizes that. It wasn't a long process of thinking. That had kind of come before, that searching and looking. He put into action what he heard in the words. So what had been the word heard becomes the fact act. Now turn to Clare, member of the nobility the upper class, people who wouldn't socialize with people like Francesco and his family who sold cloth. Clare was from the aristocracy, but she would end up joining Francis and some of his early companions when she was in her late teens. She had already rejected several offers of arranged marriage, and we have testimony from the marriage broker who had tried to barter with her about suitable partners which her uncles had chosen. And she said no, 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 and started preaching to him about changing his life and straightening up, which took him somewhat by surprise. She had been looking around, apparently, with some concern at the poor of the city of Assisi, reserving portions of food that had been set aside for her use in the household, and secretly distributing them to people who were working on the repair of churches in the neighborhood. And we think one of those people might have been Francis in the early days of his conversion. We know that she had heard Francis after his conversion in his early attempts at preaching in the town of Assisi. We don't know on what occasions. And we know that she had arranged a few meetings with him to discuss what she was looking for, and that she had finally come to a decision. She's a little bit more deliberate than Francis. Clare kind of works her way through the steps, maybe not quite as impetuous. But she came to the decision that she also wanted to follow that way of life that relied on the gospel as its pattern. So, on the evening of Palm Sunday, in the year 1212, under cover of night, without her parents' consent, this intelligent, aristocratic teenager simply ran away from home, walked with a friend in the dark from the town down to this little abandoned chapel called St. Mary of the Angels of the Porziuncola. It's actually the church that gives the name to the city of Los Angeles. So LA actually has a longer name. It's the city of Our Lady of the Angels of the Porziuncola of the Southern River, named for this place where St. Clare went. There, next to the leper hospital of the town, she met Francis and his brothers that night, and they were waiting for her. They knew that she was coming. They had torches out, and they were ready to greet her. She made a commitment there and then. She asked that her hair be cut off and that her head be covered with a veil, a sign of religious consecration. Carried out by these amateurs, Francis and his brothers, who had no permission from anyone to do this. It's a little bit of a problem, but it's okay. And her family, the next morning, guess what? Discovered that number one marriageable daughter is gone. No escort, no chaperone. That is the end of any possibility of marriage. She ran off. God forbid, maybe she eloped. She was already, however, safely ensconced in a well-fortified Benedictine abbey, claiming the right of sanctuary by the time her uncles arrived on horseback and tried to drag her away physically. She grabbed the altar cloth, uncovered her head, showed that it was shaved, and they got scared. She was claiming to be under the protection of the church. Within a few weeks, she had moved into another abandoned church. These people love abandoned churches, and there must have been lots of them around. Outside the walls of Assisi, a little place called San Damiano, where Francis, in the early days of his conversion, had worked on the construction and repair. And there, for the rest of her life, Clare lived her own form of a radical gospel discipleship. At that little church of San Damiano, oddly enough, she was eventually joined by members of her family. Her sisters, Agnes and Beatrice, became sisters in the community. Finally, her mother, Ortolana, presumably after her father's death, I don't know how else that would work, and by the time that she died, some 50 other women, mostly from the noble classes of Assisi, lived in that rather small space. It was there that Clare composed her rule or form of life. It is the first rule written by a woman for women in the history of the church. All the others were written by men for women. Clare thought it might be nice if the women decided how the women should live. Just an aside, in Berkeley, one of the most interesting groups of students that I teach are Buddhists. The large number of Buddhist students who come to study various topics at the University of California in Berkeley leads to some Buddhist monks and nuns coming, particularly from Korea, to come and study in an institute for Buddhist studies there. And I can remember one Korean Buddhist nun sitting very attentively in the lectures on St. Clare, with her head shaved and with this gray silk robe. She was rather quiet. Every once in a while she would ask a question, and she'd obviously understood Clare very well. And at the end of the school term, she turned in her project, which was a translation of the letters of St. Clare and the rule of St. Clare into Korean. Now, I had to ask a Korean Franciscan friar whom I know to review the translation because I don't know Korean, but he said she did an excellent job. She really understood what Clare was talking about. So I spoke to her at the end of the semester and I said, just out of curiosity, I said, why is it that you are so interested in St. Clare? And she says, because in Korea, she says, the monks write the rules for the nuns. And I said, so are you going back to your monastery in Korea now? She says, oh yes. And I said, well, what do you intend to do? She says, I intend to teach other Buddhist nuns about St. Clare. So St. Clare may be creating trouble in Korea, in Buddhist monasteries, even as we speak. Kind of a wonderful example. She just loves St. Clare. This rule was finally approved only as Clare was on her deathbed. In 1253, Pope Innocent IV came to see her. He had already planned to give a solemn canonization ceremony for her as soon as she had died. And it's always dangerous, of course, when you're in the presence of a dying saint whom you're planning to canonize, to say, do you have any last wish that I might grant you? And St. Clare, after 40 years of requests that were turned down, pulled out of her sleeve a copy of the rule and said, Your Holiness, a signature. And the Pope was so flustered, he didn't even sign it Pope. He put his Christian name, Sinibaldo, on it with a great big S. And she died having that rule approved, kissing it. It's from that remarkable form of life that she and her sister, her many sisters, followed, that I would like to read a couple of sections, because it speaks about the role that Francis played in their life, the inspiration that they had received about living according to the gospel, and a couple of selections here where Clare is speaking and then she allows Francis to speak. It's a lovely document. It begins in this way. The form of life of the order of the Poor Sisters, which Blessed Francis established, is this: to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, living in obedience without anything of our own, and in chastity. Further on in the rule, she writes, after the Most High Celestial Father enlightened my heart by his grace to do penance according to the example and the teaching of our Blessed Father Francis, shortly after his own conversion, I, together with my sisters, voluntarily promised him obedience. She's trying to tell us that it was in the very early days. In fact, it was just 3 years after Francis's conversion that Clare appears on the scene. When the Blessed Father, that's Francis, saw that we had no fear of poverty or hard work or suffering or shame or the contempt of the world, but that instead we regarded such things as great delights, moved by compassion, he wrote for us a form of life as follows. Now she's going to quote from Francis, from something that she received from him. Here are his words. Since by divine inspiration you have made yourselves daughters and servants of the Most High King, the Heavenly Father, and you have taken the Holy Spirit as your spouse, choosing to live according to the perfection of the Holy Gospel, I resolve and promise for myself and for my brothers always to have that same loving care and special solicitude for you as I have for them. Whatever this intuition was, this shared intuition of Francis and Clare to live according to what they call the form of the gospel, it was clearly going to unite them and their brothers and sisters in this community with bonds of affection. The sisters are not the same as the brothers. They have their own way of life, but clearly they care for each other. It's a wonderful example of mutuality. Clare then continues a few lines later. In order that we might never turn aside from most holy poverty that we had embraced, neither those who would come after us, shortly before his death, Blessed Francis wrote his last will for us once more, saying, and here she quotes Francis again, Clare Francis. I, Brother Francis, the little one, wish to follow the life and the poverty of our most high Lord, Jesus Christ, and of his most holy mother, and to persevere in this until the end. And I ask and counsel you, my ladies, it's a lovely kind of chivalric gesture, you, my ladies, live always in this most holy life and in poverty. Keep careful watch that you never depart from this by reason of the teaching or advice of anyone. The teaching and advice had been coming from just about everybody that Clare and her sisters could not follow this way of radical gospel discipleship because they were weak female creatures. That was only for the boys. That the girls needed to be taken care of by people, and they needed to live like nice, noble women in a beautiful monastery where they would do embroidery and people would pay them rent on properties that would be donated to them so they would never have to work or go without. This included a couple of popes who tried to give properties and condos and apartment houses to Clare and her sisters so they could be landladies, I suppose. Always politely turned down. Thank you very much, Your Holiness, but no, we want to follow Jesus instead. And there's actually a lovely correspondence between Clare and some sisters up in what is now the Czech Republic who are getting this same message from Pope Gregory IX. And he's writing to them saying, don't pay any attention to some people who are writing to you from Assisi, that you can live this kind of radical gospel life. They don't really live it down there anyway. Clare writes a note just as fiery off to the same people and said, even people that you must respect are not always worthy of giving advice to you. Follow what Francis did and don't pay attention to these other unnamed people. So Gregory the Ninth and Clare visited with each other. They didn't always agree. To live the gospel, that seems to be what both Francis and Clare keep coming back to, this word of the gospel. To us today, this may not seem very remarkable. If any of you have been involved in parish adult faith formation. If you've been in theology classes here at Villanova or at Newman or Alvernia or other places where you may have studied, Washington Theological Union, St. Anselm, that phrase, to live the gospel, is somewhat banal. What is a Christian supposed to do? Oh, well, I live the gospel. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Completely unremarkable. In the 13th century, that sounded weird. You want to live what? Well, we want to live according to the gospel. But you must be kidding. You're not supposed to do that. The church doesn't teach you to do that. And it didn't. And to some degree, we can understand why. Listen to the reasoning. Clare and Francis speak about the gospel as the form or the pattern for their lives. It's the key to their spirituality, to all Franciscan spirituality. It's diverse in its expression. Clare is not the same as Francis. Francis is very worried about some aspects of the gospel that don't seem to bother Clare too much. She's concerned about other pieces of the gospel that seem to just fly right by Francis. But both of them wanted to form their lives according to this pattern which they saw. People of the time would think that they were looking in the wrong book of the Bible. If you want to know how to live, you don't look in the gospel. It's not what it's for. Most teachers and preachers in the church in their day, so 1220 to 1250, would say that the way to live Christian life was expressed in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, not in the gospel. And it's particularly in chapter 2 where Luke, the author of Acts, presents maybe kind of a rosy picture of the early Christian community at Jerusalem. There we see the life of a community of Jesus' early followers who lived together in peace and harmony after the resurrection of the Lord and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. It's almost as if this form of Christian community kind of came down with the tongues of fire into Jerusalem, and it was neat and organized, and it just worked swell. The believers, Luke writes, were of one mind and one heart. Okay, Peter and Paul had some differences, but basically everybody got along. And Ananias and Sapphira, that was unfortunate. They were just smitten. That's okay. The good people, however, held all things in common. Whatever they had, they sold and contributed to a kind of common fund that took care of the least advantaged in the group, particularly the widows and the poor. The resources of the community served a common good. All things held in common created bonds of interdependence and trust. There was an important office within this Jerusalem church, which was that of the apostles. We know the names of some of the leaders. Peter and James were certainly leaders in that church. And the apostles were the teachers. The community participated in regular times of prayer. We hear of the apostles going up to the temple at the 3rd hour and the 6th hour for prayer in the temple of Jerusalem. And the brothers and sisters of the community of Jerusalem gathered in their own homes for the breaking of the bread and the prayers. Perhaps an early allusion to the Eucharist. Here's a pattern of life for an early Christian community that could be applied to any later Christian community. Stable, economically sound, a settled existence in a holy city with a nice temple. Who could ask for anything more? Over the centuries, many groups of Christian men and women had used the pattern, the life of the apostles in Jerusalem, as described in Acts, as the model for their lives. It was called the apostolic life, or the life of the apostles. It was supposed to mirror the community at Jerusalem in the Acts. Francis and Clare never talk about the apostles or the acts of the apostles as the pattern for their life. They speak about the gospel. They're talking about a different model of Christian life. If we think about it, quite different from what Luke describes in regard to the Jerusalem community. They're not trying to follow the example of the apostles in Jerusalem after Pentecost. Peter is wonderful. We love St. Peter. A little unreliable when you get into difficult times, okay. Seems to be afflicted by kind of chronic doubt at certain times in his life. Could be a little bit sneaky when he was eating with Gentiles, and then the observant Jews came around, he'd pretend, no. Never had that pork burger, would never do that, no. And Paul has to come around, wag a finger at him, you were eating that pork and you know it. But the apostles, as wonderful as they are, were not the inspiration for Francis and Clare. Neither Peter, nor Paul, nor James, John go down the list. Yes, they're saints, but that's not who I'm here to follow. It's the life of Jesus and the men and women disciples who followed him that we read about in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. Those were the interesting people. This is a different kind of community. It experienced life as moving around from place to place. It didn't have community property holdings in Jerusalem or any place else. And in fact, this was a community, if we remember, was not very well received in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not a good place for Jesus and the disciples, but rather a group that moves along the borders of Jewish, religious, and political society. Preaching, teaching, healing, walking among the Samaritans and the tax collectors and the Gentiles and the lepers and the mad people, visiting the villages in the Galilee, starting out in all places in Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can you see how this would seem a little bit dangerous? If you lived in a 13th century church society that liked order, because God is orderly, what we have as order in the church is what God has established. And that order is seen in the Acts of the Apostles. That's the pattern for Christian community life, so follow it. And these two people who never studied theology, who had never had any training in a religious community, one who sold cloth and thought he was going to become a soldier and then didn't, and this other kind of strong-willed, somewhat stubborn young noblewoman, that the two of them are going to teach the church a new form of, we really think this is a bad idea. They're nice people. They pray, they love Jesus, but they're wrong. They shouldn't live this way. They should live the life of the apostles, and in fact, we have a number of nicely approved rules, and we could just give them one to follow, including the rule of St. Augustine, which they tried. Didn't work. The rule of St. Benedict for monks. No. Thank you. The so-called rule of St. Bernard, the constitutions or the bylaws of the Cistercians. No. Cardinal Ugolino, who would later become Pope as Gregory IX, is pictured with Francis and a group of 5,000 followers in the year probably 1220 or 1221 on the plains below Assisi in a kind of Jesus campout down there, in which Francis and his brothers are trying to get their rule approved. They've been working for 14 years on this, and it hasn't quite gotten to the final redaction. And Cardinal Ugolino, who's an expert on getting religious communities organized, he's the one who's going to try to organize Clare, and doesn't work too well. He says, listen, we've got the rule of Augustine, we've got the rule of Benedict, the rule of Bernard, just pick one. They're already written, and you can get on with your life. Write some little clauses at the end to make it more specific for you, put a CZ at the end, and everybody will be fine. Francis, who was very respectful toward cardinals and popes and clergy and everything, takes Cardinal Ugolino by the hand, which is a lovely gesture, I think, and very Italian. Come on, Your Eminence. Gets him in front of the whole group there. And you can imagine the poor unsuspecting cardinal thinks, well, I finally talked sense into Francis. And Francis gives him a big smile and addresses the whole group, and he says, don't speak to me anymore of Benedict. Don't speak to me of Augustine. Don't speak to me of Bernard. The Lord has called me to be a new kind of fool in this world. And he will insist on that as he is dying in his testament, written at the very end of his life, where he will say, and you can almost hear this determined voice, he said, no one showed me how I should live. The Most High revealed to me that I must live according to the form of the Holy Gospel. And I had this written down simply and in few words, and the Lord Pope confirmed it for me. That's what we're celebrating this year, 800 years from its first approval. Adamant, absolutely adamant on this point, both he in his way and Clare in her way on the deathbed. Sign it, just sign it. Thought that this was really something worth sacrificing a great deal for. Church officials at the time really believed that the way of life described in the gospel was only meant to be lived during the years of Jesus' earthly ministry. After the death and resurrection of the Lord, the sending of the Spirit at Pentecost, that is, the birth of the church, the Acts of the Apostles gave the pattern for life in the church from then on. No turning back. The early life of the disciples and Jesus, that life on the road, in poverty, barefoot, traveling from place to place. They're always talking about washing feet. Why? Because their feet are always dirty, because they're always walking around. If they just stay at home, they wouldn't be dirty. That way of life, without any fixed source of income, without much structure, except the structure of the master and the disciples, that's it, Jesus and everybody else, that brief span from the baptism by John in the Jordan to the time of the Lord's death and rising and the sending of the Spirit, that form of life was meant for that period of about 3 years. How long was it? Maybe 3 years. It was tough enough to live during that time. You couldn't do it longer than that. The community of disciples that existed before the church was born, that church before the church, was not meant to be a pattern for anyone after Pentecost. That's the church of Jesus and the disciples. What we are called to follow is the church of the apostles. Yes, of course, we should be inspired by the way that the early disciples lived with Jesus, but we're not meant to live that way today. Just get it out of your pretty little heads. That's not going to happen. This helps to explain why it took such a long time. For Francis, 14 years. For Clare, 40 years to get their rules approved. Francis did receive a kind of verbal approval by Pope Innocent III in 1209. So that's the reason for the 2009 birthday party going on here and elsewhere around the world. But it would take another 14 years until 1223 until he got the final stamp of approval on a very different kind of rule. Much briefer, bit more canon law in it, but still the essentials of the gospel. Clare, as we said, received approval for her way of life, patterned on the gospel, only on her deathbed, 1253. So the spirituality of Francis and Clare can be summed up in that one expression: to live according to the gospel. But in order to do that, we always are going to select. We're always going to emphasize. And I think when we look at Francis and Clare, we see certain aspects of the gospel that spoke to them most strongly. The first remarkable thing is that Francis has very little interest in context in the gospel. All those stories that kind of set up the scene, the disciples were walking along, and as they came across a fig tree one day, one of them was saying to them, he kind of skips over that, fast forwards to where Jesus is speaking or doing something. Then, pay attention. He's very interested in the words of Jesus. It's not the way that we approach Scripture today, but he really took these as quotations that were pretty close to what Jesus said. He didn't have any doubts about, he didn't have any higher criticism. He's not doing Scripture study in an academic sense. He looks for the words of Jesus, and he really takes those seriously. An Italian scholar named Carlo Paolazzi, has done an analysis of the words, the vocabulary in the writings of Francis. And he comes up with an amazing statistic. This is by computer generating word forms as they appear in Francis and as they appear in the text of the Gospels as it was translated into Latin in his days. Something like 85 to 90% of Francis's vocabulary is taken from words that are spoken by Jesus in the Latin text of the Gospel. Which means that even in his speaking and his writing, Francis is trying to limit himself to words that are spoken by Jesus in the New Testament. That demands terrific control of your vocabulary. The other piece that he's very interested in is what he calls the deeds or the footprints of the Lord. These are wordless gestures of Jesus. These are the acts of healing, the acts of washing feet, for example. These gestures that are full of symbolic significance. And Francis really pays attention to them and tries to do similar gestures himself, as if performing these gestures somehow allows him to get inside the skin of Jesus, using the vocabulary, the words, and the actions, the deeds of Jesus. He's coming to kind of understand who this person is from the inside, and seems to come to understand himself by doing it. For both Francis and Clare, this kind of intense, laser-like focus on the person of Jesus, almost to the exclusion of everybody else. Rarely a quotation from St. Paul. Rarely a quotation from the letters of St. John. The second letter to Peter gets quoted a couple of times. St. James' epistle once. Book of Revelation a couple of times. Almost everything is focused on Jesus and his words. And that focus leads them to emphasize poverty. A poverty grounded on the fact of the incarnation. The Word became flesh. This captured their religious imagination. The story of the Nativity, the Annunciation, the birth in a manger, the visit of the shepherds. These gospel descriptions, the infancy narratives, portrayed the Lord as a poor child, welcomed by other poor people, born among animals because there was no room for this poor family in the inn. Francis would later write that Jesus was born for us along the way. Could also be translated along the side of the road, indicating that right from his birth, the life of the Lord would be precarious and difficult. And Clare writes in regard to her sisters how they should think of their clothing. Remember, these were mostly noble women. That when they're thinking about how they should dress, what they should focus on is those swaddling clothes that wrapped Jesus in the manger. Something just to keep the straw off of him. Another aspect of the life of Jesus and his early disciples that struck both of them was the fact that they were pilgrims and strangers. People on the move. In his earlier rule, the version he thought he would get approved in 1221 when he was kind of giving Cardinal Ugolino a lecture, and nope, it wasn't approved. It said that his brothers should travel through the world like pilgrims and strangers, quoting from, I think it's the second letter of Peter. He says that this was the way that Jesus and his earliest disciples lived. He writes, "He was a poor man and lived on alms, he and the Blessed Virgin and the disciples." In reading and hearing the gospel, what struck Francis so strongly was the movement of Jesus from place to place. The words about the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. This was a precarious life. He observes him being a guest, almost always a guest, in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He's with Simon the leper. He's in the house of Simon Peter when Peter's mother-in-law is ill. He's with Zacchaeus and his friends, in the company of Matthew and his tax collector buddies. Even at his last meal with his disciples, Jesus has to ask somebody else for a room in which they can eat the supper. Jesus relies on the alms of others, on their hospitality extended toward him as one would treat a pilgrim or a foreign visitor. That's the way Francis also wants to live. Certainly another piece of Franciscan spirituality that is emphasized in both the writings of Francis and Clare is the mystery of the cross. But the mystery of the cross not as a tale of suffering, but the mystery of the cross as a tale of love. Clare writes beautifully to her friend, her pen pal, Agnes of Prague up in Bohemia, about the life of Jesus by using the image of a mirror. Agnes was a princess of the royal family of Bohemia, and these two noble women knew about mirrors. Most people had never seen a mirror in their life. The mirror that Clare talks about is not a flat reflecting mirror like we have today. It would be like a very shiny frying pan. If you turn it upside down and you've polished the bottom of the Revere-ware copper pan, on the bottom there, in the middle, if you squint a little bit, you could kind of get a picture of your face there. You know, my grandmother's kitchen, you could actually see your face in the bottom of the pan. It's a round, shiny metal disc, a looking glass. Looking at this image, Clare says that this is like the life of Christ. Around the outer edge, you see the infancy. As you move in closer, you see the life of the earthly ministry. And in the very center, where you see the best reflection, that's where you see the suffering of Christ on the cross, which Clare says is the example of great charity. That's what you see. When you look at the cross, you see the ineffable charity which led him to suffer on the wood of the cross. The devotion of Francis and Clare to the cross of Christ is devotion to love for others. That is what the cross communicates. The focus is on the greatness of love rather than on the greatness of the suffering. And that is to be mirrored in Agnes as it is in Clare. Become what you contemplate. Francis himself composed what we might call a new book of Psalms, commonly called his Office of the Passion. In a kind of cut and paste operation, before this was really very easy to do, Francis took lines and words from the book of Psalms and rearranged them in order to tell a different story, but using the words that come from the Psalms. And what he does is he tells the story at the beginning of this office of the last days, the last hours of the life of Jesus, from his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane until his death and his resurrection. He weaves together lines from the Psalms that give an emotional expression to what is going on within Jesus as he's looking out at these people who are coming toward him. It's a powerful piece of literature. Francis often spent time in meditation outdoors. He loved to go up into the mountains, particularly and into caves. And it is said that he often was found there weeping. And when asked the reason for his tears, he would say that love is not loved. It's a reference to Christ. That affective, emotional connection with the birth, the life, the sufferings of Christ, and his glorious resurrection mark Franciscan spirituality to this day. Much more than a matter of the head, it involves the heart. The deep connection of human feelings like compassion or solidarity, sadness, joy. These feelings, the heart as the point of our deepest place of encounter with Christ, and therefore with the Father whom we see when we look on the face of Jesus. There are certainly many other facets of the spirituality of Francis and Clare that we could explore, but it would take far too long. There is one, though, that I think all of you would expect in a lecture like this, and I'll mention it at least briefly. It's that sense of kinship that Francis expressed in his most famous poem, the Canticle of the Creatures, or the Canticle of Brother Sun. The lyrics themselves, in an early form of Umbrian Italian dialect, in fact, the earliest piece of Italian poetry, was composed by Francis for this canticle. And he composed a musical melody to sing the verses, though we don't have the melody anymore. In this canticle, Francis calls all creatures brother and sister, obviously meaning that they share with him a common parent. Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Fire, Sister Mother Earth are related to Francis because they are all siblings of the beloved Son, the one through whom all things were made. This, Christ, is the firstborn of all creatures, a kind of elder brother to absolutely everything and everyone in the universe, from human beings to rocks and stars. And this beautiful song of praise was composed by Francis while he was a guest of Clare at San Damiano when he was about to be treated for a terrible eye disease. The doctor was down the road. And according to his early biographers, he was nearly blind and could not see sunlight or even candlelight without excruciating pain. So his eyes had to be covered with bandages. And this little hut in which he was staying, apparently, was overridden with mice that crawled all over him and crawled on his food. And he's in the dark and he's blind. And it's there that he composes this great song of thanks and praise. With this cosmic view of kinship, Franciscan spirituality considers the material universe as something very good. This is not an obstacle. This world is not an obstacle in the journey to God. The created world is a gift. It's an expression of God's love. It bears the image of the beloved Son, the Word made flesh. It breaks down the barrier that some people see between God and the world, or between matter and spirit, between creator and creatures. This great Trinitarian communion of persons has come to dwell among creatures as the beloved Son becomes a creature himself, to lead all creatures, his brothers and sisters, toward their true home in the heart of God the Creator. It's wonderful insight, and one that is translated into dozens of languages as people still sing that canticle around the world today. But it's time to end. And any talk about Franciscan spirituality must end with joy. This is a certain antidote to any kind of gloomy Christianity which Francis identified as the religion of hypocrites. It can be found in the delight that Clare speaks about, that Francis noticed among the sisters, even when they faced hardship. Francis himself, even with the suffering in his life, found it hard to contain that joy he felt when he saw God's goodness that welled up in him. And there's no better story than this to speak about joy when you can dance in front of the Pope. Again, from the earliest biography, 2 years after his death. Once, St. Francis came to the city of Rome, and he greatly yearned to speak before the Lord Pope Honorius and the venerable Cardinals. Get a picture of a very solemn group here. Lord Ugolino, he still puts up with Francis. He led the holy man before the Lord Pope and the Cardinals. As he stood in the presence of so many princes of the church, Blessed Francis fearlessly began to speak. He was speaking with such fire of spirit that he could not contain himself for joy. As he brought forth the word from his mouth, he began to move his feet as if dancing, not playfully, but burning with the fire of divine love, and not provoking laughter, but moving them to tears of sorrow. Many of them were touched in their hearts. Notice that again? Touched in their hearts. Amazed. I can imagine they were amazed. What in the world is this? Amazed at the grace of God and the great determination of this man. I have something so wonderful to tell you that I have to dance it. Francis had been speaking in words. Things like my words that hover in the air for a moment like the oxygen around us. We can't see them or touch them, though we can record them. But then something happens. Francis gives his flesh to the Word. The Word becomes flesh as he begins to show in his body what he tried to say with his words. And that's when the Cardinals feel it. They're not laughing. They're weeping tears of sorrow touched in their hearts. In their sight, that Word became flesh. Francis made it happen by dancing. And this year we celebrate the 800th anniversary of that way of life that he and Clare pioneered. He, the brilliant dancer, poet, singer, writer, friend of lepers, and brother to birds and sun and moon. With that rule based on the gospel, shared with the vision of Clare, and their spirituality, still inspire nearly 1 million Franciscan men and women, lay and religious, around the world today. The saints of Assisi have given us a great treasure, a way of life simply focused on the words and actions of Jesus in the gospel. On this birthday, 800th birthday of the movement, let us return thanks and praise with the concluding words of that Canticle of the Creatures. O praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. May the Lord give you peace.
When Francis gave up the life of a soldier and the desire to be a knight and to go to the Crusades, I know he went to the Holy Land and walked on coals, but did he condemn the Crusades? Did he condemn the use of force to try to turn Muslims into Christians?
Francis, to the best of my knowledge, was not very good at condemning. And I think he followed a pretty good example of someone else wasn't so good at condemning. What he did, and it's remarkable, in 1219, he simply got up and took a boat to Egypt and asked to be introduced to the commander of the Islamic army, Malek el-Kamil. Got beat up a little bit by Muslim security forces. The Christian forces wouldn't allow him to pass. They said, we can't guarantee your safety. The battle lines were drawn at Damietta on the mouth of the Nile. Francis eventually got to the Sultan, and the Sultan treated him kindly, offered him gifts, listened to him very willingly. Francis came back, tried to convince the Christian troops to accept the offer of peace made by Malek el-Kamil, which he had made repeatedly. They refused it, and Francis was present for the annihilation of the Christian forces by the Islamic armies later that summer. Grief-stricken. He spends about a year in the Middle East. He kind of disappears for a year and shows up about a year later in Italy. After his death, Malek el-Kamil invites the Brothers of the Cord to become the custodian of the Christian shrines in the Holy Land under his protection. And we're still there to this day, the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land, and I'll be there next week. And as some of you may know, it is still Muslims who keep the keys of the holy places for us. Because you can't trust Christians with them, because we fight with each other. So, yes, beautiful story, an example of peace without making judgments about anyone. Great example. Yes?
Well, would you say a little bit more about Clare's rule and what's special about her rule with the women?
Clare's rule is remarkable because what she envisages is a group of mostly noble women. They don't have to be, but as a matter of fact, most of them were, who were going to live by manual labor. Oh, that's not the way noble women are supposed to live. And she's not going to accept any income-producing real estate to maintain the community. They're simply going to live by what they can make. They worked in the cloth trade, which was really socially downward mobility, producing pretty good quality cloth. We still have some of it around, particularly for churches in the area. That was their one source of work. And other than that, they would live by begging. This was the bone of contention with popes and bishops and cardinals. They could not see a women's community that would live in this kind of radical poverty. It's also a life that is as contemplative or more contemplative than that of Francis. Great devotion to the celebration of the divine office, but also a great ministry of healing. After Clare's death, we have these remarkable witnesses who come. You can almost see their faces. Men and women from the town of Assisi. When somebody was sick, particularly children, you knew where you had to take them. You took them to Clare at San Damiano. You know, the little boy who stuck the pebble up his nose. I mean, they've been doing this for 800 years too. And he was getting blue in the face because he couldn't breathe. His nose was swelling. And Clare makes the sign of the cross and, you know, out comes the stone. It's this beautiful everyday life where Clare is really seen as kind of the healer of Assisi, a great figure of prayer, but also a determined champion of the poverty of Christ. It's a great rule for that reason, and still lived by some 30,000 poor Clare nuns to this day. Anybody else? Francis, Clare, yes. Kevin.
Just a small point. I've often heard it said that the Pope was, one of the popes that she was not accepting the rule from was her cousin. Or was related to her?
Well, I don't know. There's some Italian families are big, but I hadn't heard about her being related to any of those. She certainly loved to tangle with Gregory IX, and he loved to try to outmaneuver her.
Is there a contradiction between the deep respect for the Church and authority of Franciscans in general, and that conflict, not accepting the rule?
No, I mean, Clare was very obedient, but it was always with this, they would give her, she had 3 or 4 rules that were given to her primarily by Cardinal Ugolino. He'd come up with a new rule and say, here, try this one. And she would basically say, thanks, but no thanks. And she kept this kind of dialogue going, saying, the thing about St. Benedict, you got that wrong. We're not Benedictines. We're following the other guy. Would you correct that? Well, no, I think St. Benedict is good. Well, I've got another rule here. Would you like to approve that? No, I'm going to write. But she keeps going. And they had tremendous respect for her, too. So she's, it's like Francis, holding the cardinal's hand by saying, don't talk to me about that anymore. You know, what is that? It's personal relationship and honest disagreement about something important, because they really believed it was God's inspiration, and that they could lead Cardinal Ugolino. They could lead him along. If that was really what the Lord wanted, it would become clear to him as well. And eventually it did. So it's kind of this, it's a lovely personal thing where, yes, you're respectful, but I want you to see what God has inspired in me. He'll make it clear to you. And look out, because I'm praying for it. Yeah. Yes?
I can never remember where I read things, so I have no idea where I got this, but wasn't there some controversy regarding the idea, like the poverty of Christ? Was that during this time with Francis and Clare, or was it long before that?
No, it was actually, it was not so long afterwards. A group of Franciscans began emphasizing the poverty of Christ and forgetting a little bit of that charity part, you know, which is pretty important in the gospel too, you know. And it became a kind of a politicized campaign that was mixed in with some funny apocalyptic, the end is near thinking, that poverty was actually the sign of the end of the world, and that Francis was the one who was kind of introducing the last judgment. So he's like the reappearance of St. John the Baptist or the prophet Ezekiel, and, you know, a little bit hallucinogenic when you read some of this stuff. Well, the Pope, John the 22nd, bad Pope anyway, decided that he'd had enough of this nonsense and told this group of kind of fringe Franciscans, who were called the spiritual Franciscans, that their emphasis on the poverty of Christ was so exaggerated they were risking heresy, and so stop. And they said, well, we won't. So he says, okay, and he burned him at the stake. That caught some attention in the downtown Marseille in France. Arguably the first French friars, I suppose you could call them. But John the 22nd, then, there was a reason why it took so long before we got a Pope John the 23rd. This was in 1320, and Pope John the 23rd, like 1950s. It's because he was kind of, he was an extremist. He then came out with this doctrine that you had to believe that Christ and the apostles owned property. At which point, a whole group of Franciscans decided that he was a heretic and left. They actually ran away from the papal court and says, we think now the Pope has lapsed into heresy. So this has been popularized in a novel and film called The Name of the Rose. Umberto Eco. Yeah. It's based on a real event in Franciscan history. And there are actually t-shirts that have pictures of these friars.
Why is the most lasting image of Francis the one with him feeding the birds?
Walmart. I mean, that's one of the reasons. We love to put Francis in a bird bath because it domesticates him. If we do the little bunny rabbit and, you know, Fluffy the squirrel and the parakeets, it tames this radical guy. We can put him in the garden and leave him there. It's a romantic vision. It's a kind of 19th century romanticism that recast Francis as kind of the friend of animals and wandering through nature, kind of vague, kind of Thoreau of the 13th century at, you know, Walden Leper Pond. And, you know, there are pieces of Francis's story that just don't fit. It's the hard side of Francis, the suffering, the cross, the desperately poor people, the lepers, that's the part that we feel uncomfortable with. So we can domesticate him by giving him Fluffy the bunny. Yeah. Which just sends a shiver up my spine. Yes?
In light of Francis's relationship with his father and that profound break, is there any evidence of an attempt at reconciliation?
For those of you who don't know, Francis made a very dramatic break with his father when he went through his conversion. He tried to give away basically all of his father's money to the poor. Bad plan. And it was actually the bishop who had to tell him that he didn't have any right to do that. But he does have kind of a public confrontation with his father in front of the bishop, and takes off all of his clothes, hands them to his father, standing there buck naked in front of the bishop, and says, from now on, I'm just going to say, our Father who art in heaven, not my father Pietro. There's no evidence that he ever had anything else to do with his whole family. Probably, again, based on his understanding of the gospel, unless you hate father and mother, brothers and sisters, you're unworthy to be my disciple. No evidence of... His half-brother, in fact, seems to have gone out of his way to kind of mock him and make his life miserable. And Francis kind of... Yeah, Angelo, yeah. Maybe a half-brother, we don't know. So, no reconciliation with the family. Gone. We wish, for the sake of family dynamics and all, that psychologically it would be better. No. Break with the family, absolute.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank Brother Bill. It was just wonderful this afternoon. And to thank all of you for coming. And the next time we will come together, the theme of Francis is, in the Franciscan tradition, is November 11th, where we will have a talk on St. Bonaventure by one of our own faculty members, Kevin Hughes, who's teaching a course on Bonaventure this semester. So we hope to see you back then. And, it's interesting, it seems like the church for centuries continues to have a problem with property. Thank you very much.
Thank you.